From a peaceful Alaskan marathon to a serene wildlife study, these ordinary moments turned into life-or-death battles. How did these unsuspecting individuals survive or tragically fall when a grizzly bear emerged from the shadows? Join us as we explore these terrifying stories of survival, bravery, and the untamed power of the wild. Can we really withstand what nature can unleash? Are we able to face its most ferocious predators? Let's find out together. In May 2008, Igor Ivanov, a man hardened by years of frustration and disappointment, and his 13-year-old son named Misha, visited a zoo in their city, Moscow. Despite being father and son, Igor and Misha couldn't be more different. Igor strained to always respect the rules, despite the fact that he had always struggled to control the rage simmering beneath his rule-abiding exterior. Igor was a 47-year-old, and life hadn't been kind to him. His face was carved with deep lines and wrinkles created by years of worry and frustration. In truth, Igor hated his life. His marriage was a shadow of what it once was, a union held together only by the shared responsibility of raising their son, Misha. Igor's relationship with Misha was strained at best. The man didn't understand his son. He always pressured Misha to be the best, the smartest, the most athletic, and Misha was cracking under the pressure. Misha, a lanky 13-year-old with a mop of unruly hair and a rebellious spirit to match, was everything Igor could never understand. To Igor, who saw the world in uncompromising terms, Misha was too relaxed, too uncaring. Misha was failing in school, which infuriated Igor. The 13-year-old's grades were terrible. Igor wanted Misha to grow up to be a doctor or engineer, but his son's grades and his lack of responsibility weren't enough. Every report card, every teacher's note was like a dagger to Igor's heart, a reminder of his own failures as a father. That day had started with a parent-teacher conference. The meeting had left Igor seething, the teacher's words echoing in his mind over and over again. Misha isn't living up to his potential. The car ride to the zoo, meant to be a distraction, had been silent. The tension between Igor and Misha was palpable, almost unbearable. They walked through the zoo without speaking. The silence was heavy. They passed cages and enclosures without really looking at the animals. Igor's mind was a thunderstorm. The man could feel himself getting closer to a mental edge. After about 20 minutes of walking aimlessly, they arrived at the grizzly bear enclosure. The enclosure was a massive pit surrounded by high walls topped with thick bars made of metal. The ground within was a mixture of dirt and rock, the terrain uneven and rugged, replicating a forest. At the center of the pit was a large cave, the entrance dark and foreboding. A shallow pool of murky water glistened under the pale sunlight. A single grizzly bear roamed the space. The animal was massive, a king in its cage. Its fur was a mix of brown and gray. Muscles rippled beneath its thick hide. It moved with a quiet power, its eyes scanning the surroundings with a predator's gaze. For the first time since arriving at the zoo, Misha was captivated by an animal. He didn't listen to his father as the man started yelling at him, his words full of anger, frustration, and desperation. Igor shouted about Misha's poor grades and bad attitude. He couldn't understand how Misha could be so indifferent, so unconcerned about his future. But Misha kept watching the grizzly, fascinated by the animal. And then the boy made a fatal mistake. He rolled his eyes at his father, unaware of the impending danger. Igor's rage finally boiled over. His vision narrowed, everything else fading into the background as his focus zeroed in on his son. Misha was standing too close to the edge of the enclosure, watching the animal, oblivious to the danger both outside and within. At that moment, Igor acted without thought, without reason. Suddenly, he stopped being a father and became a creature of rage. It was a primal instinct, a raw, unfiltered emotion that drove him forward. His hands shot out, shoving Misha with all the force he could muster. The boy's eyes widened in shock as he stumbled forward, arms flailing as he fought to regain his balance. But it was too late. Misha toppled over the edge, his body twisting in the air as he fell. The world seemed to freeze as Misha hit the ground with a hollow thud. Everything was still for a second, and then chaos erupted. The crowd gathered around the enclosure started screaming and shouting. Some began to cry, others rushed to get help. Misha lay motionless, his body sprawled awkwardly on the rocky ground. And then the grizzly bear saw the boy. The animal lifted its massive head, eyes locking onto the intruder in its domain. Misha could barely breathe. He was hurt, but now he feared he was about to die. He thought of his dad silently begging him to help, but he couldn't speak. He was too terrified. Misha knew he had to help himself. And then he remembered one of the lessons Igor had drilled into him during their trips into the wilderness. Stay still. When faced with this kind of bear, the only hope was to become as unthreatening as possible, to convince the animal you were dead and unappealing. Misha forced himself to remain motionless. He took small, shallow breaths. The bear began to move, its massive form lumbering toward him with a slow, deliberate pace. The ground trembled slightly with each step, the vibrations reaching Misha's body. He could hear the low rumble of the bear's breathing, a deep sound that filled his ears. The bear paused just a few feet away, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Misha remained still, but he was terrified. He wondered if the bear could smell the fear on him. The bear lowered its head, its wet nose brushing against Misha's leg. Still, the boy didn't move. The bear sniffed along Misha's body, its hot breath washing over him in waves. Every second stretched into an eternity, the tension so thick it was suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had approached, the bear pulled back. It turned away and entered its cave, no longer interested in the intruder. The crowd above let out a collective sigh of relief. And then, zoo staff sprang into action. They used tranquilizer guns to sedate the bear. Then they entered the enclosure, and Misha was lifted out, his body limp with shock but otherwise unharmed. A few minutes later, police arrived at the scene and arrested Igor. The reality of what he had done began to seep in. He was no longer angry. He was horrified by his own actions. Igor was arrested on the spot, his hands cuffed behind his back as he was led away. The incident made the news, sparking immediate outrage and calls for stricter security measures. Misha was returned to his mother, who decided right then and there to get a divorce and protect her son from Igor, who had committed such an unspeakable act against his own son. On August 23, 2019, 29-year-old Josh Voigt, an experienced mountain biker, was out on a routine ride in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. Josh had always been drawn to the wild, and especially to the Canadian Rockies, which had always been a backdrop to his life. Josh would often find his escape in the mountains. He was the kind of biker who sought out the most challenging trails. He lived for the blend of adrenaline and peace that only the wilderness could offer. Josh had a deep respect for nature, understanding its dangers but never letting them deter him from the thrill of the ride. He had encountered wildlife before, deer, elk, even a black bear once. But he had never truly felt threatened. But that was about to change on that fateful day. On August 23, 2019, Josh chose one of his favorite trails, a rugged path that twisted through dense forest, climbing steep hills before plunging into narrow valleys. He started late that afternoon. The sun filtered through the trees, casting shadows on the ground. The air was warm, but not unpleasantly so. The only sounds were the crunch of Josh's tires on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Josh was completely focused on his cycling. He didn't know he was being followed and had been so for miles. His stalker was a grizzly, moving silently through the undergrowth. The bear had caught Josh's scent early on. It wasn't unusual for grizzlies to roam these parts, but this one was different. It hadn't eaten properly in days. The animal was hungry, which sparked an aggressive pursuit. It followed Josh for miles, moving closer and closer, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then Josh rounded a sharp corner, the trail narrowing between two large boulders. As he leaned into the turn, the world turned into a blur. He didn't quite understand what was happening. In reality, the source of the chaos was the grizzly, which had charged, hitting Josh with the force of a freight train. The impact sent Josh flying off his bike, his body crashing to the ground. Josh struggled to catch his breath and understand what had just happened. As he tried to push himself up, the world started spinning, and then the bear was on him. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over the man, then dropped down with a powerful swipe of its paw. The blow caught Josh across the back, sending him sprawling face-first into the dirt. The grizzly growled. Josh couldn't believe it. He was about to die. The animal moved closer, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches from the man's head. Josh's instincts took over. He ran toward his bike, which lay a few feet away. Every step hurt, but Josh forced himself to move. His bike was his only chance to survive. And then, when Josh was almost there, the bear lunged again, its claws raking across his leg, tearing through fabric and flesh. Josh cried out in pain, but kept crawling, each movement in agony. With a final, desperate lunge, Josh reached the bike. He grabbed the frame and hauled it up, using it as a makeshift shield. The bear struck again, but this time its claws clanged against the metal. The force nearly knocked Josh off his feet, but he held on, bracing the bike between himself and the animal. Each time the bear attacked, Josh pushed back, desperate to survive. But Josh feared he couldn't hold out for long. His arms were already growing weaker with each passing second, and his leg was giving out. Josh could barely stand on it. But somehow the man managed to keep the bike between them, pushing back with every ounce of strength he had left. The Grizzly was growing frustrated. The animal stopped shortly, eyes locked on Josh as if it were calculating its next move. Josh realized this was it. He had to take this chance, because there was no guarantee he would get another one. Summoning the last of his energy, he pushed the bike toward the bear, using it as a barrier to create some distance between them. Then, with a burst of adrenaline, he turned and ran, limping heavily as he made a break for the trees. The bear hesitated, sniffing at the bike, unsure of what to make of the strange object that had resisted its attacks. This hesitation was all Josh needed. He didn't look back, focusing only on putting as much distance between himself and the bear as possible. His breath came in ragged gasps, each step sending jolts of pain through his injured leg, but he forced himself to keep going, driven by pure survival instinct. He didn't dare look back. If the bear was following him, Josh thought it would be better if he didn't know. Branches whipped at his face and arms, but he didn't stop. He then reached a steep incline and began to climb, pulling himself up with trembling hands. The bear wasn't following Josh, but the man didn't stop until his instincts told him he was safe. He collapsed against a tree, his body shaking from exhaustion and pain. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. It took time, but eventually Josh managed to get back to his feet. He started limping back down the trail, every step a reminder of the narrow escape he had just experienced. The journey was slow, each movement painful, but he kept going, driven by the will to survive. He emerged from the forest hours later. He was found by a group of hikers who quickly called for help. Josh was taken to a hospital where he was treated for his injuries, severe but not life-threatening. News of the Grizzly attack spread quickly through the biking community, sparking discussions about the dangers of outdoor sports in bear country and the importance of preparedness. As for Josh, he was lucky to be alive and eager to get back on his bike. On September 15, 2000, 36-year-old Adam Norton was a homesteader living in Alaska's wilderness. Adam had always felt more at home in the wilderness than in any of the cities he'd ever been in. As such, he had spent the better part of the last decade living off the grid in Alaska. He didn't need much to feel at peace with life. The rustling of leaves, the calls of distant birds, and the gentle whisper of the wind through the trees were enough for him. He found modern life too crowded, too noisy, and too polluted. He lived in a cabin made of logs and stone, miles away from the nearest town, deep in the forest. Adam had built the cabin with his own 2 hands during months of hard labor, and it was his biggest pride. Yes, it was small, but it was sturdy. He was sure the cabin could withstand anything. He had no electricity and no running water, but he did have a wooden stove, his trusty stools, and other essentials. Moreover, he had all that land, an endless stretch of the wilderness that provided everything he needed. What else could a man wish for? Adam hunted, fished, and grew what he could. He was more than happy to provide for himself. When he thought about getting old out there, he knew he would let the land claim him and not fight it. He belonged in the wilderness. On September 15, 2000, the day started like any other. Every day was a routine. He would wake up at dawn and then eat a simple breakfast. After breakfast, he would head out to check his traps or tend to the small garden he had cultivated. Afternoons were spent gathering firewood or hunting, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he moved silently through the forest. Evenings were quiet, spent by the fire, reading from his rather large collection of books or simply listening to the sounds of the night. That morning, when he stepped outside, Adam saw that the forest was calm, but he had an uneasy feeling. It was strange. He had never felt like that before. Still, he had work to do, work that couldn't wait. He had planned to spend the day gathering firewood, preparing for the long winter that was just around the corner. With a hatchet in hand, Adam ventured deeper into the woods, following a well-worn path that led to a stand of trees he had been working on for the past few days. It was hard work, but Adam enjoyed it. Hours passed, and Adam lost himself in the task, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the solitude that sometimes, not too often, but still weighed heavily on him. The pile of firewood grew steadily, each log stacked carefully beside him. But as he reached for another log, something happened, something that would change his life forever. A big grizzly bear suddenly sprang out of the underbrush, its growl piercing the air. Adam barely had time to react before the bear was on him. The impact knocked him off his feet, the hatchet flying from his hand as he hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. And then, the bear's claws racked across Adam's body, tearing through layers of clothes and flesh. The animal's massive jaws snapped shut inches from the man's face. Its breath was putrid. Adam didn't know what else to do but to kick the animal. If he didn't fight back, he wouldn't make it alive. He knew it for sure. As he kicked at the animal, Adam remembered his hatchet. He reached for it. His fingers closed around the handle just as the bear reared up, preparing to strike again. In one fluid motion, Adam swung the hatchet with all the strength he could muster, the blade slicing through the air and into the bear's side. The bear let out a deafening roar of pain and anger, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Instead, the animal was even angrier. Its claws caught Adam across the arm, leaving deep gashes that started bleeding on the spot. Adam gritted his teeth against the pain and swung the hatchet again, this time aiming for the bear's head. The blade struck true, embedding itself in the bear's thick skull. The bear's roar turned into a low, guttural growl as it shook its head, trying to dislodge the hatchet. Blood streamed down its face, but still it pressed the attack. Adam knew he couldn't keep this up for long. His strength was fading. He was just a man, and this was a terrifying creature. But he refused to give up. These woods were his home, too. He had the right to be there. He had survived in these woods for years, and he wasn't about to let it end like this. With one final effort, he wrenched the hatchet free and swung it again, this time with all the force he could muster. The blade is connected to the bear's neck, cutting deep into the muscle and sinew. The grizzly collapsed to the ground, its body convulsing as it collapsed to the ground. Adam staggered back, happy to be alive. But he wished things had been different. Killing the bear brought him no pleasure, only a sense of guilt and shame. Adam's body was a mess of cuts and bruises, his clothes soaked with blood. He knew he couldn't stay there. He was losing blood fast, and if he didn't get help soon, he wouldn't survive. The man turned and made his way to his beloved cabin. He could barely see or walk, and the path ahead looked endless. He pressed on. Adam was tough, he knew that about himself. Finally, the cabin came into view. Adam's heart leaped at the sight, but he knew he wasn't safe yet. He practically fell through the door, his hands trembling as he reached for the radio. His fingers fumbled with the dials, his mind racing as he tried to remember the frequency of emergency services. When a human voice came through, relief washed over Adam. He realized he was crying as he managed to say a few words, enough for the person at the other end to realize what was going on. Then as soon as the person reassured him that help was on the way, Adam collapsed on the floor of his cabin. Now all he could do was wait. He woke up in a hospital room a day later. His injuries were severe, but he was on the road to recovery. He had survived the attacks against all odds, and he was going to survive his hospital stay too. The story of his battle with the grizzly bear quickly spread, becoming somewhat of a legend in the local community. To those who heard it, Adam Norton was a symbol of the incredible resilience and determination it took to live in such a harsh and unforgiving place. On August 31st, 2021, 27-year-old wildlife researcher Kendall Scott was studying grizzly bears in Canada's boreal forest. She had spent months documenting the majestic creature's behavior and had a good feeling that she was doing groundbreaking work in the field. Kendall had always been attracted to the wilderness ever since she was a little girl. Her fascination with wildlife led her to pursue a degree in biology with a focus on animal behavior. As a researcher, Kendall's passion became her profession, and at 27, she had already made a name for herself in the field of wildlife study. She had chosen to focus on one of the most majestic and misunderstood creatures in North America, the grizzly bear. And now, here she was, deep within the boreal forest in Canada. This particular forest was perfect for Kendall's research. The forest was a rugged, remote expanse of dense coniferous trees, cold rivers, and untouched wilderness. It was home to a variety of wildlife, including countless grizzlies. Kendall was determined to better understand their behavior, particularly how they interacted with their environment and with humans. The researcher had been documenting the animals for months and had come to be attached to some of them. She used trail cameras and other remote monitoring techniques, not only because she didn't want to interfere with the animals' routine and change their behavior, but also for the sake of her own safety. As much as she loved the animals, Kendall treasured her own life more. She spent countless hours in the field, setting up cameras, collecting data, and observing the bears in their natural habitat. The work could be boring, and it required patience, but Kendall had plenty of that. She truly wished to contribute to the conservation of these magnificent animals, to show the world that they were not the mindless killers many believed them to be, but complex, intelligent beings deserving of respect. Since she spent so much time watching the animals, she now had her favorites. One bear in particular had caught Kendall's attention. She had nicknamed him Teddy because of his slightly smaller size and the sweet, almost unthreatening appearance he had. Teddy was a frequent visitor to 3 of her camera sites, and he provided Kendall with valuable insight into the behavior of bears. He had always seemed calm, even curious, as he sniffed around the cameras, occasionally pawing at them before moving on. To Kendall, Teddy was proof of the grizzly's gentle side, a bear that defied the fearsome image often associated with his kind. That Tuesday, Kendall set out to retrieve data from one of her trail cameras. This particular camera was the most remote one, located far from any human activity. However, it still was a routine task, one that Kendall had performed plenty of times with no incident. As such, she wasn't particularly worried about her trip to the forest. It was a cool, early morning. Kendall moved through the trees with ease. But as she approached the camera, she realized something was out of the ordinary. At first, she couldn't quite place it, but then Kendall realized what it was. The forest was eerily quiet, a far cry from its usual liveliness. It was perhaps better to work quickly and get back to her base. When she reached the camera, Kendall hurried to download the data. Her thoughts were racing. On the one hand, she was thinking about her research. On the other, though, she was worried by the unusual stillness of the forest. And then the silence was shattered. It began with a rustling in the bushes. Kendall turned toward the sound just in time to see Teddy, her favorite grizzly, emerging from the undergrowth. But Teddy wasn't his usual, apparently harmless self. Instead, his posture was tense, his movements quick and agitated. This wasn't the curious, gentle bear she had come to know. Teddy's eyes locked onto her with an intensity that sent a jolt of fear through Kendall's body. Kendall instinctively knew she was in danger, but there was no time to think, no time to react. In a split second, Teddy charged. The bear covered the distance between them in a heartbeat, his massive form barreling toward her with terrifying speed. Kendall's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for her bear spray. But it was too late. The bear was on her before she could even grasp the canister. Pain exploded in her side as the bear's claws tore through her clothing and into her flesh. The force of the attack left her stunned, her vision blurring as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't the Teddy she had observed from afar, the bear she had stupidly considered almost a friend. This was a wild, untamed force of nature, driven by instincts she could never fully understand. Kendall fought hard with everything she had. She thought of her aging parents, of her older brother and his kids, her nephews. She tried to kick, to push him away, but her strength was no match to his. The bear's weight pinned her down, his claws raking across her body with savage fury. She could feel her life slipping away, the world around her fading into pain and fear. Teddy's behavior was uncharacteristic, displaying a level of aggression that Kendall had never seen before. The bear attacked with shocking ferocity, as if driven by some deep primal rage. There was no escape, no chance to reach her bear spray, no time to call for help. Kendall's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but they were all drowned out by the overwhelming reality of the attack. She was dying. It was over quickly. The bear's final crushing bite took Kendall's life. Later that day, when Kendall didn't return to the research station, her colleagues grew concerned. A search party was quickly assembled, and they fanned out into the forest, following the trail she had taken that morning. They found her soon after. It was obvious from afar that she was dead, her body as still as the trees. Nearby, the trail camera still recorded, capturing the tragic final moments of her life. The footage showed the attack in chilling detail, providing insights into the bear's behavior that would haunt those who watched it. The team had no explanation for Teddy's behavior. They, too, knew Teddy as one of the gentler subjects of their study. But the harsh reality was that Kendall was dead, and Teddy was to blame. The discovery of Kendall's body and the footage stunned the wildlife research community. The incident led to a re-evaluation of the risks involved in studying large predators in their natural habitats, a dark reminder of the dangers that come with the territory. For Kendall's colleagues and those who knew her, the loss was devastating, a bright life cut short by the very creatures she had dedicated herself to understanding. Nestled in the heart of Montana's wilderness, Camp Roosevelt was a beloved summer camp, a place where children came to learn the skills of self-reliance and survival. As such, kids aged 8 to 14 could learn how to navigate the wild, build shelters, start fires, and understand the delicate balance of nature all summer long. The counselors, some of them older and more seasoned than others, were dedicated to teaching the children how to fend for themselves, instilling in them a sense of confidence and respect for the natural world. The camp was a cluster of log cabins, all neatly located around a central clearing that served as the heart of the camp. Right in the very center of the clearing was a large lodge, which doubled as a meeting hall and a dining area. Nearby, there was a smaller structure, the kitchen building, where staff worked almost around the clock to keep hundreds of children fed. The campgrounds were a carefully maintained area where the children could safely explore under the watchful eyes of the counselors. It was late on the night of July 5th, or rather early in the morning. The camp was quiet. Even the kitchen was empty, the stuff gone to grab a few hours of sleep before the chaos that was sure to erupt at breakfast time. The children were asleep in their cabins, their energy spent after a day of hiking and learning. The counselors, too, were winding down. Some gathered around a small fire outside the lodge, and others checked on the campers before turning in for the night. The air was cool, the stars bright in the clear Montana sky. It was a typical night in the wilderness, peaceful and still. Or so everybody thought. In reality, an unwanted intruder had wandered into the camp. Attracted by the mouth-watering scent of food, a huge grizzly bear made its way through the trees, its sense of smell leading it directly to the camp's kitchen. The scent of stored food was irresistible to the animal, which had gone a couple of days without eating anything but a few unsatisfying berries. With a forceful swipe of its paw, the bear broke through the door and entered the kitchen. Inside, the bear found what it was looking for. The smell of meat, bread, and other supplies filled its nostrils, driving it into a frenzy. It tore through the shelves, scattering pots and pans, ripping open containers, and devouring anything it could find. The noise was deafening, the sound of metal clanging and wood splintering echoing through the night. The counselors heard the commotion immediately. Their hearts raced as they realized what was happening. A bear in the camp was every outdoor instructor's nightmare, a situation they trained for but hoped they would never face. Panic spread quickly as the counselors sprang into action. They had to get the children to safety before the bear turned its attention to the cabins. They had to save them from a potentially horrifying fate. It didn't help that the children were now awake, disoriented, and scared. The counselor knew they were racing against the clock, so they moved quickly as they gathered the children from their cabins and led them toward the main lodge, the safest place in the camp. The children huddled together. The older ones tried to console the younger, all of them afraid. The bear was still in the kitchen, but they knew it wouldn't be long before it emerged, possibly more aggressive after its raid. Among the counselors was a 23-year-old man named Lee Taylor. It was Lee's third summer working at the camp. He loved the place and enjoyed working with children. As such, he was somewhat of a favorite among the campers. He was patient and funny, and his kindness was obvious in the way he always went the extra mile to ensure everyone was safe. Lee had grown up in Montana, not far from the camp, and had spent his childhood exploring the very forests that now surrounded him. As the counselors ushered the children into the lodge, Lee took up a position near the door, ready to help if the bear approached. The bear, meanwhile, had finished its rampage in the kitchen and was now roaming the campgrounds. The counselors had hoped the bear would be sated by now, but obviously that was not the case. The bear now moved towards the nearest cabin. Lee saw the animal coming closer to the children. He had no choice but to act. He moved away from the lodge, attempting to draw the bear's attention away from the children. He made noise, waving his arms, trying to make himself appear larger. The bear stopped, its head turning towards him, its eyes locking onto the movement. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as the bear and Lee faced each other. And then, the bear charged. Before Lee could even think of escaping, the bear was on him. Its claws tore into him with savage force, its jaws clamping down with deadly precision. Lee had no time to act. The bear was too powerful, too fast. And then, Lee was gone. But he died a hero's death. While he was being attacked, the counselors managed to get the children inside the lodge and secure the building. They then called for help. The authorities responded swiftly, and a team of wildlife officers was dispatched to track down the bear. The bear didn't get far. The officers found it less than a mile from the camp, still in the forest. It showed no fear, no sign of retreat. The decision was made quickly, and with a single shot, the bear was killed. The threat was neutralized, but the damage had already been done. When the morning light broke, the camp was a different place. The once lively and cheerful atmosphere was now heavy with sorrow and fear. Lee Taylor's body was recovered and taken away. The children were escorted home. Their summer adventure was cut tragically short. Discussions on how to balance outdoor education with safety became more urgent as the reality of the risks was brought into sharp focus. Lee Taylor was hailed as a hero, and his memory became a part of the camp's legacy. It was June 2, 2024, and the 60th edition of the Alaskan Marathon was underway. The marathon was famous for its breathtaking scenery and rugged terrain, attracting runners from around the world. Towering mountains and dense forests made for a thrilling race that offered participants a chance to test their endurance and enjoy nature's raw beauty. The route wound through rugged trails, crossing rivers and climbing steep inclines, with every turn revealing another stunning vista. But unbeknownst to the participants and the organizers, the marathon would be remembered not for its views or the challenge it presented, but for the terrifying event that unfolded midway through the race. At some point during the race, the runners were naturally spread out along the trail, each of them pushing themselves to their limits as they navigated the challenging course. Among them was an 18-year-old called Louise Hewitt. Originally from Seattle, Louise was a passionate runner. She was the youngest participant this year, and she had trained for months in anticipation of the marathon. Many admired her determination to be a part of the marathon. She was focused, her pace steady as she moved through the forested section of the trail. Louise was the Grizzly's first target. The animal charged out of the dense undergrowth, its eyes wide with panic and aggression. Startled by the sudden appearance of so many people in its territory, the bear had lashed out, its instincts taking over. Louise was caught completely off guard, and she was so young and frail. She never stood a chance as the bear's powerful body slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. The animal went directly for the kill. It opened its massive jaws and then clamped them shut on Louise's skull, crushing it. In less than 2 minutes, the young woman was gone. Race organizers had prepared for the possibility of a bear encounter, but nothing could have fully prepared them for this. As soon as the bear appeared, volunteers and staff rushed to the scene, armed with bear spray and air horns. They shouted and waved their arms, trying to divert the bear's attention away from the runners. The air filled with the acrid scent of bear spray as the organizers deployed it in an attempt to create a barrier between the bear and the remaining participants. But the bear was too confused, too agitated. Its instincts told it to attack. The animal continued to thrash about, its massive paws swiping at anything that moved. As the bear continued its rampage, the runners closest to the attack scrambled to escape. Panic spread like wildfire, and in the chaos, several people were injured. Some were trampled as the crowd surged toward safety, while others, unable to move quickly enough, found themselves in the path of the bear. The beast struck out at anything in its way, its claws and teeth inflicting deep wounds on those unfortunate enough to be within reach. One runner, a man, fell to the ground and twisted his ankle as he tried to run. Another runner, an older woman, tried to help the man up, but she was caught by the bear's powerful swipe, the force of the blow sending her sprawling into the underbrush. In the meantime, the race organizers were desperate to find a solution to this horrifying ordeal. They kept blasting their air horns and deploying their bear spray. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear ran back into the forest. The immediate danger had passed, but the damage was done. Louise Hewitt was dead and several others were injured. Emergency responders arrived quickly, attending to the injured and assessing the situation. The bear was eventually tracked by wildlife authorities and, deemed too dangerous to be left in the area, was put down. The decision was met with mixed emotions, but authorities had to think about the public and their safety. The attack sparked a heated debate about the safety of organizing large events in areas densely populated by wildlife. The allure of the wilderness, so central to the marathon's identity, was now a source of concern. Could such races continue without putting lives at risk? The organizers decided to go on with the marathon, but they agreed to name it after Louise Hewitt, whose life was cut so short but whose spirit continued to inspire them.